Record. All right.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining in because I agree this is a really important topic wherever you are working in senior living. So, my background, so I'll share a little bit about me. You can see who I am. I'm the National Director of Education with Select Rehabilitation. We're a contract provider throughout the country. I'm an occupational therapist by background. I've been in practice now for a little over 30 years, so quite some time. And my background is actually in neurology, which is kind of fun. But I've been working in long-term care for quite some time as a researcher, as an educator. And I think what I'm most proud of, and you'll probably see it on the last slide, I think I actually have my credentials that I'm certified in dementia care. So Montessori, a dementia care specialist, and also a fall specialist. So in addition to being a National Director of Education with Select, I am also an adjunct professor at Gannon University in Erie, Pennsylvania. I live in Delaware, just a little bit north of Rehoboth Beach, if anybody is familiar with that. But I'm currently tuning in, as you saw in the chat, from Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, where I'm spending the week with my family. So little bit about me, and let's just jump into this topic because again it is important. My background, as I said, is in mostly long-term care, but what we're seeing, and we'll introduce it as we go along, is bullying is really everywhere in senior living. So assisted living, independent living, senior housing, long-term care, even in people's neighborhoods where they're living, and we'll learn more about that as we go along. And I have to be honest, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because I have young children. So I have a son who is 14 and a daughter who is 12. And this is a narrative. This is something they've been talking about in schools now for quite some time. They know, what bullying is, what it looks like, what I should do, who do I tell, etc. And when I considered the fact that there might be bullying among our seniors, I'm going to be very honest. I said, no, really? Is that really a thing? And sure enough, it absolutely is a thing. It's a very serious concern. And as we go through this, you're going to hear a lot of stories as well. Every one of them is 100% real. In some cases, the names have been changed to protect individuals, but every story that I tell you is real. So let's talk about what our objectives are for today. We are going to talk about the incidents and the characteristics of bullying behaviors. We'll talk about the 5 different types of bullies. We'll talk about their targets as well. We'll describe the impact of bullying on all older adults. So not just the target, but also the bully, and also those living or interacting in that environment as well. And then we'll talk about a bunch of different strategies. We'll talk about strategies specifically for the organization. When I use that term, I use that term kind of loosely. We'll talk about interventions as well for the bully and those for the target. And as Sarah said, please do not hesitate. If you have a question or a comment, you want to pop that into chat. I'm happy to monitor the chat and address those as we go along. So I thought we would start out with a few stories. So the first one is the story of a high rise. A woman who, and again, very real, who saw herself as the queen of the parking garage, would key cars for people who she felt crossed her. If you parked in her, what she considered her parking space, even though there were not assigned spaces, or if you did something to her, she would key your car. The laundry room. And I love when I teach this, in a room full of people, because I always ask the question about, do you remember when you were in college and you went, if you weren't quick enough to go get your laundry, where was your laundry, right? It was on the floor. Maybe if you were lucky, somebody put it in a bushel basket. Who knows where it was, but laundry rooms are vicious places in senior housing in general, where we see the bullies come in and they steal detergent, they steal clothes, they throw clothes onto the floor, what have you. We see bingo rooms or activities in general become these battlefields where there are newcomers who are new to that that activity or to that community, and they are accused of cheating by veteran players, or they're not given a seat. They won't let them sit there. Oh, that's safe for so and so, or they're just, again, not made to feel welcome. In some of the worst cases, we see bullying going far beyond the bingo squabble or, anything else. And again, true story, a woman by the name of Marcia Wenzel, she moved into an apartment complex in Illinois after her partner of over 30 years died, and her partner's family evicted her from the home that they were sharing, that the couple shared. So she moved into this senior living community, and she was met with relentless bullying, largely for the fact that she was a lesbian. So a couple things happened to her. One man hit her scooter with his walker and then just unleashed this barrage of homophobic slurs at her. In the dining room, somebody ran into her dining room table and literally flipped her table over. She would go into the elevator and people would spit on her. It got so far as she went into the mail room at one point, and someone came behind her and hit her in the back of the head with an object. So I will share that hitting her on the back of the head, that goes past bullying. That is now assault, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But somebody screamed at her, "Homosexuals will burn in hell." I mean, then the stories go on and on. And I'm going to read you her words. "I just go in my room and barricade my door and just pray. I felt like a slug, like I was nothing, like I wasn't even human. I felt like a person in a pool of piranhas." So that's the impact of bullying on an individual. So as we start to look at, excuse me, what is the definition of bullying? I want to just share this for a second because I mentioned kids and our adolescents, our youth, our school age children have learned so much about this. The definition for them isn't any different than the definition for us. If we look at the definition of bullying, at least according to the federal government, it's defined with three core elements. Those are unwanted aggressive behavior, a perceived or an observed power imbalance or a power differential, and a repetition or a high likelihood of repetition of those behaviors. And we're going to come back to that definition a couple different times. The reality is bullying can be direct. So it is in the presence of that targeted individual directly in front of them. Or it can be indirect. And that's a lot of times what we will see in our communities where, we spread rumors, gossip, sniping, talking behind someone's back, those sorts of things. And we'll talk more about what those types of bullying behaviors look like as we go on here. So, what's the incidence of bullying? Again, this is really interesting. So, when you look at the communal nature of senior living in general, senior housing, I don't care where seniors are congregating, it can be good. It can be wonderful because it opens up this door where you can make new friends, you can meet new people, get involved in things. But on the flip side, it can open up the door to cliques and some of this type of behavior. And what we're even seeing, and it's really interesting, we're seeing this even out in the community at large, where there's a neighborhood or something and one couple or one person they're not invited to the neighborhood barbecue or the neighborhood activity for whatever reason that person is considered different. We are seeing a lot of that too, and well, I'll talk about it in a little bit, a different type of bullying, so I'll hold that thought for a second. So when we look at the incident, the numbers that I have on the screen here, the most recent that I was able to find, and this comes from an AARP study that was completed, and they say anywhere between 10 and 20% of older adults in any type of senior living community are bullied. And what's interesting though is that some studies that you'll read, some smaller studies, they actually have those numbers maybe just a little bit higher, 20 to 25%. A lot of times, because it's tough to tease out really how much of this is happening, those precise numbers, because it goes unreported. And it goes unreported on two different levels. There's first that senior who doesn't say anything, or the people around them don't say anything, because here's this person who is, 70 years old or 75 or whatever, and they're living in this community and they're being bullied and they're embarrassed. They feel shame related to that, so they don't speak up, or sometimes they don't speak up because they fear retaliation or continued bullying. We also see that we, as individuals working in these types of communities, or providing service in these communities, we don't speak up because we'll see something and just say, oh, that's just how they are. They'll work out their differences. It's not that big of a deal, when it really is a big deal. And we oftentimes don't speak up and address it. So slowly but surely, we're getting a lot more light shed on this situation. And we recognize that, again, those behaviors that we saw, when people were kids, we see a lot of those same types of behaviors as adults. So when we look at where is this happening? Again, it can happen in a number of different places, contexts, locations, etc. So as I mentioned, senior living, senior centers, adult day health, rehab facilities, assisted living, independent living, nursing homes, really, again, anywhere our seniors are congregating. We oftentimes see this too in those places during events or activities where individuals are sharing resources. So that could be the television, that could be the elevator, the stairwell, the parking garage, the laundry facilities, wherever it is that they are needing or required to share resources. We're starting to see more and more bullying using technology, which is so interesting. So phone, email, social media, Instagram, Facebook. A lot of times folks kind of hide behind social media and say whatever they want to say. I'm part of the Nextdoor app in my neighborhood, and I don't know, maybe you guys are too. And I see people just, wow, firing off comments that are so rude. And again, that's an online type of situation. Now, we also, again, I mentioned this earlier, but I'll say it again. Some of the bullying that we look at can fall into criminal types of categories as well. So it goes past name calling or what have you, and it could be harassment, it can be hazing, it can be assault, whereby we would need to bring in, obviously, some level of authority. Now, the vast majority of our senior to senior aggression is, in fact, verbal abuse, and we'll talk more about what that looks like. Men and women are equally as likely to be the victim, equally as likely to be the aggressor. Now, there are some gender differences that we'll talk about that play out in the literature, but by and large, again, they can be either. So the types of bullying behavior. So there's typically just four main types of bullying behaviors. The first is verbal, and it's just what you think it is. Name calling, teasing, insults, taunts, threats, sarcasm, pointed jokes, maybe pointed jokes about somebody's nationality, the way they speak, their country of origin, what have you. So here's an example. Mary was overheard at a senior center luncheon talking about Grace, or saying something to Grace. And she said, well, you don't know what you're talking about. Everybody knows you're crazy. Now, on the surface, is that like the worst comment ever? Of course not. But it's still bullying. Think about it. And how many times maybe have we heard something like that, where somebody, said that about another person and we've just kind of ignored it? The reality is that is, in fact, bullying. Physical. Physical is just what you think it is. Again, pushing, pinching, biting, punching, hitting, hair pulling, stealing, destroying property, etc. And I want to make a comment here. So here's my story here. Two gentlemen, again, real story, in independent senior housing, got into an argument over the remote control. One wanted to watch one program, another wanted to watch another. And at one point, the one gentleman punched the other in the nose. Now, what's interesting there, and this is what we have to recognize, is that it didn't start by punching this person in the nose. It started way back with something verbal. There was some sort of altercation verbally between these two. And we have to recognize that bullying oftentimes will escalate. So if we see people duking it out, punching each other, coming to this physical stuff, we miss the signs probably. Something, and I guess it could happen, but more often than not, something happened verbally and we didn't see those signs, or it was ignored. Some antisocial behavior. So this is shunning, excluding, gossiping, maybe mimicking somebody's walk, mimicking their disability, or again, the way they speak. Maybe they have aphasia or a history of stroke or something like that. Spreading rumors, using offensive gestures, facial expressions, just turning somebody's head, turning away from them, when you're talking to them instead of looking them in the eye, using threatening body language. And I'll give you two examples here. One is, again, a real one, a gentleman who was living in New Orleans post Katrina. His nursing home that he was living in was severely damaged and had to be relocated. He was relocated to somewhere in Massachusetts. And prior to his arrival, a number of individuals in that community spread the rumor that he was a longtime homeless individual, and he was just the first in a deluge of homeless individuals who would be coming to this community in Massachusetts. So by the time he got there, no one wanted anything to do with him. I'll tell you a personal story, and this happened to me in my own hometown. I volunteer with a local food pantry, and the person in charge of that pantry, I could look this person dead in the eye. Hi, hello, how are you? How can I help? What can I do for you? How are you doing today? As friendly as could be, it wouldn't matter. This person would turn their back to me, never look me in the eye, would not speak to me, would walk away from me while I was talking to them. So that's real types of bullying behaviors. Relationship centered, okay, ostracizing during meal times, possibly activities, forming those social cliques that we see is sometimes occurring in our communities. So, what is that adage? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me, right? We probably heard that maybe as we were children. That is contrary to all of this. Contrary to that, yes, bullying actually impacts not only the target, but those around that person as well. And I'm not going to read this slide at you, but these are some of the responses that individuals will have to bullying. So, depression, changes in eating or sleeping, social isolation, withdrawal, stress, anxiety, etc. And what this really does, and I think we'll talk about this on another slide as well, is when we see this, and again, some of those other types of body functions, migraines, GI tract, etc. But when we see this, and if it's not addressed particularly, it creates this environment of fear. It creates an environment of disrespect. And again, not just for the individuals living or engaging in that community, let's say it's an adult day program, but also for the folks who are working there. Now, the one question that I get all the time is, what about dementia? So we're going to talk about that a little bit. The situation, the type of behavior will often determine whether or not it is truly bullying behavior. So let's go back to the definition of bullying. Unwanted behavior, right? Sometimes unwanted, problematic behavior, if you will. Repetitive, or at least a likelihood that it could be repetitive. And then again, this power imbalance or this power differential. So those are the three elements that need to be there. So you may have someone living or engaging in your community, and they strike out at people because they just don't know how to deal with a problem, or they don't know how to deal with things when they don't go their way. Now, that's problematic behavior. It violates, I am sure, your community rules, but it may not necessarily be bullying. It might just be, this is really how this person, they don't know how to deal, if you understand what I mean. So it truly may not be bullying behavior. We may have somebody who, again, yells out because they're frustrated or they're upset. That's a way that they communicate their feelings. Again, problematic, probably against or violating your community rules, but not necessarily bullying. We look at dementia, likewise. That person may be kicking, biting, whatever. Again, is it bullying? It's possible, but probably not. We probably don't have that true power imbalance there. So again, you have to look at the situation, and I'm not saying we would address every one of these situations, but not every one of them would necessarily be bullying. So hopefully that makes sense. So that said, some of those things are problematic. Those problematic behaviors, they don't meet the textbook definition of bullying, but those individuals on the receiving end can still feel as if they were being bullied. And I love this study, and I realize that's a little bit old, but Boniface went into a number of assisted living and independent living communities and asked the question, what are the behaviors that you see in your community that are causing you distress? And this is what they said: being bossed around, negotiating value differences. What does that mean? Especially related to diversity of beliefs stemming from culture or spirituality or socioeconomic status, those sorts of things. Sharing scarce resources, witnessing psychiatric behaviors, especially those that are really frightening, listening to other people complain. So again, you look at this list and some of these are bullying, some of them are not, but it begs us to look at bullying and bullying-like behaviors to determine, what's causing them and what can we do about them. So let's start looking at the individuals now, the individual who bullies. You know, most of us like to be in control. We want to be in charge of our situation, and we do that in ways that doesn't impact somebody else in a negative way. In contrast, a bully is going to utilize power and control and those strategies at the expense of others. They find it positively reinforcing, if you will, to make other people feel threatened, fearful, hurt. They contribute to that conflict, etc. They suffer from low self-esteem. So by putting somebody else down, they're building themselves up. They struggle with individual differences, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more as we go along. So there are essentially five types of bullies. The first is the narcissistic bully, and this is not someone we typically see, but this person, they do not share empathy with others. But what's really interesting about this person is they plan their bullying activity. And so I'll give you an example there, and I don't remember where I was, and somebody gave me this example, and it stuck with me. It was again, a senior living community of some sort, and there was an individual who lived in that community who practiced Judaism, was Jewish. And every night that person or every morning they woke up to swastikas on their door, notes underneath their door, just some horrific things. And they came to find they didn't have cameras in the hallways. They installed them later to figure out who was doing this. And it was someone who honestly planned this bullying behavior every night at like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, planned out that bullying, was targeting this person, and that's a narcissistic bully. So somebody who just asked if the slide presentation is available. Yes, that is going to be sent out after the session. So thank you for asking that question. So we don't always see the narcissistic, but that's a good example of one. We do see the impulsive bully. This person is spontaneous. They plan their bullying. They don't plan it, is what I meant to say. Even if there's consequences, they have a hard time restraining themselves. They are going to, if they see an opportunity, they're going to take it. We talked about the physical and the verbal bully. It's just what you think they are. And then there's this secondary bully. This person doesn't initiate the bullying, but they join in just so they don't become the target down the road. They probably feel bad about what they're doing, but they're more concerned about themselves. It is self-preservation. It is survival of the fittest. They join in, they become part of the mean girls, if you will, just so that they are protected down the road. So I did say, there we go. There are a few gender differences, and these are not absolute, but this is just what plays out in the literature. Typically, we see women being a little more passive aggressive. They are more emotional and manipulative. They look at those clicks. And men, on the other hand, are typically a little more spontaneous. They could be verbally or physically aggressive. They're protective. And what's interesting about that protective characteristic is it's not just of things, the remote control or a chair or space or something like that. They're protective of people as well. She's my nurse. He's my therapist. Back off, that sort of thing. So they're very protective of us as staff as well. So why do people bully? And again, you can certainly read the slide. One big piece of that is transitioning. So think about, an individual moving into some sort of senior housing or senior living. They maybe lived in a 2,400 square foot home or whatever, 3 bedrooms. Here they are now in a small apartment. And maybe they haven't lived communally ever. Maybe the last time they lived in communal living was college or shortly thereafter. So they have this powerlessness sometimes moving into this more supportive communal environment. So we need to be looking at those folks who maybe are having a tough time transitioning into our communities, and maybe pay a little bit more attention to them, helping them to manage, because those individuals who have a tough time transitioning might possibly be our bullies. I already mentioned, we'll talk more about this when we get to other strategies, but bullies do put other people down to build themselves up. That self-esteem is certainly not there. The other thing is, they're looking for some level of control. And so they'll look sometimes to make these common areas, so the day room or the activity center or whatever, they try to convert that into more of a personal space. So again, thinking about that transition and how well they are transitioning to that communal living. I did mention dementia. Again, somebody might have a tough time communicating or having issues with dementia that, it, again, may look like bullying, probably isn't bullying directly, but some of those behaviors are the same. Okay, so that's our bully. Now let's talk about our targets. So before I even talk about the target, I have to make a comment just to say, in contrast to the bully, the the target falls victim because they have trouble defending themselves. And I'll say this probably a couple times, the target does nothing to cause the bullying. They don't do anything to bring this on specifically. The issue is with the bully. The issue is not with the target. So that's important. But some of their characteristics make it difficult sometimes for them to defend themselves. So generally speaking, there are two different types of targets. The first is a passive target. This person is emotional. They have difficulty reading some of those social cues. They are different. That's all I can say. They are different. It's racial, it's ethnic, it's spiritual, it's sexual orientation, it's gender identity. It could just be they have a different hair color. I think about my daughter who was bullied about a year or so ago on the school bus because she had red hair and someone made fun of her red hair. It might be the way they dress. I don't know what it is, but somehow, shape, or form, they are different. This is why oftentimes immigrants and refugees will fall into this category because English maybe is not their first language. Oftentimes the passive target is perceived to be shy and insecure. And sometimes it's not really shyness or insecurity. It could be a developmental disability, as we're seeing individuals living much longer with developmental disabilities. It could also be that that person has a mild cognitive impairment, or possibly early stage of Alzheimer's or a related dementia. But again, they're different. That's the best way to say it. Then there's this provocative target. And I love that photo. It reminds me of my father-in-law. I think that's exactly what he looks like. So the provocative target is annoying or irritating to others. They're intrusive. And again, this person isn't specifically doing anything, but you know this person. This is a person who says, hey, you going to that activity? Will you save me a seat? Can I sit next to you? Can I go with you? What are you doing today? And they're just kind of there in their space. And it's not necessarily an issue with the target as much as it is an issue with the bully who doesn't know how to handle that appropriately. They bully instead of walk away, or instead of saying, you know what, there's no room, or somehow working out those differences or something. So the provocative target is there. So warning signs of a bully. You can certainly read this, but they intimidate us. They intimidate others in their environment. I mentioned this, they lack that empathy, they're bossy, etc. And one of the things about a bully, and I think this is interesting, pay attention to that person who's coming to you and complaining in this outrage style. They won't let me do this, or they're picking on me, or whatever. Oftentimes that person who is that outraged complainer, if you will, they are the bully themselves versus actually being bullied. Now, the warning signs of a target: they self-isolate, they don't go to activities. So they've always gone on the community outing and now they don't want to go anymore. Or they've always gone to an activity, now they don't want to. Or they are going someplace in that environment and they take this very long circuitous route to go somewhere so they don't have to pass by where that bully might be. They make vague complaints. They don't like me, they won't let me, etc. And we see an acute onset of depressed mood. And I do want to make mention of that for just a second. And it really depends on what setting we're in, what we're doing about screening for depression. I think a lot of us are probably using the PHQ 2 to 9. Maybe some of us are using the PHQ 9. Maybe others are doing something else. But really, really pay attention to that depressed mood. Again, I work in long-term care where we do that PHQ 9 on our first MDS, and then we don't do that for quite some time. We have to pay attention to that transitioning senior, even if it's just from their home in the community to senior housing, or from senior housing to independent living, or even wing to wing within some sort of setting. Every time we have a transition, the likelihood or the risk, if you will, of suicidal ideation and depressed mood stays there for easily 8 months post transition. So it's something we really want to keep our thumb on, looking for that acute onset of depressed mood, because that is a hallmark really of the target. So when we look at the impact, again, I mentioned this. Sometimes we just say, oh, that's just how they are. There's really nothing I can do. And we ignore it. And again, that passivity, we think that maybe this is just a social irritant. There's no lasting harm, but nothing could be further from the truth. There are a lot of negative emotions, a lot of negative responses related to bullying. And as I mentioned, bullying behaviors can escalate. Again, another real story, and this is an old one. It came from 2009, but still so pertinent. Two women actually in a nursing home. One was 100 years old, the other was 98. And they were arguing over the neutral zone, if you will, between their beds in their room. One felt like the other had maybe an inch or two more of space than the other. And it was verbal, verbal, verbal until it was no longer verbal. And the 98-year-old roommate was killed by her 100-year-old roommate over a few inches of space in their room. So you look at that situation, you say, gosh, we could have done something there. We could have moved them. We could have mitigated that. That's why we don't ignore it. You'll hear me say it. If you see something, say something. If you see something, say something, do something. Remember too that individuals who witness the bullying can have negative consequences. So, they have they feel this culture of fear, of disrespect, of insecurity, particularly if the bullying is not addressed. It reduces resident satisfaction, individual satisfaction, staff satisfaction. And we really haven't talked so much about that. But the reality is, individuals can bully us too. We might be different in some way, and it doesn't matter whether it's us or families come in and bully sometimes. We're not going to tolerate it. So that's where we come to, what can you do? This is really easy. Get to know people. Get to know people. The signs of elder abuse are the same as the signs and symptoms, if you will, of bullying. So really get to know folks. Shall I say, that sweet little old lady who suddenly just snaps. Well, that could be some cognitive issue. That could be dementia. It could be a sign of dehydration, a UTI, something like that. But it could be something totally different. Look for that person who has always been outgoing and involved and now is not. So again, just really recognize where those changes are occurring. And so I mentioned this early on, there's the three-tiered intervention model. And this largely looks the same as what we do for our adolescents and our youth. But we're going to talk about the organization, we'll talk about the bully, we'll talk about the target. But I will say, of the three of these, the organizational intervention is going to be the most critical, and that's where we start. So when we look at a community, I don't care what the community is, there's a culture that defines its norms, its beliefs, its attitudes. And every individual who comes to that community, whether you work there or you live there, They bring experiences, expectations to that place. And again, we can see interactions being very positive, we can see them being negative, but every interaction is going to impact that culture. So, what we're looking to do here is have a positive living environment. That's what we're going for. So, how do we do that? I think some easy things. We develop clear rules and expectations, not only for individual behavior, but also for staff behavior. And when we start to develop those, we bring the individuals who live in that community into that discussion. So they're a big part of that. So they help to develop some of those rules. We can certainly add language related to bullying to admission agreements for both the individual moving in and possibly for our families as well, because sometimes, again, I'll give you my background. We'll have a resident in long term care who is bullying, and the family knows about it because they bullied at home. And we have to say to the family, well, I'm sorry, this is unacceptable behavior. This person can no longer stay here. So sometimes it's a contract, not just with the individual, but also with families. I love the idea of just regular group discussions about the challenges of communal living. Again, we don't live there, we work there. So we don't really know what their struggles are, what their challenges are. So we hope that they talk out some of those differences and they bring them to us, but we don't always know that that will happen. Employee training is huge. And I will tell you, I'm not a huge fan of role playing, but this is a great time, I think, to role play and bring up some of these scenarios. I know every one of you has seen something that is either bordering on bullying or is outright bullying that you can bring up and say, how should we have addressed this? What could we have done differently? What do you think? And do that training. We already talked about taking complaints seriously. Any complaint that comes to you, you really do have to look at it, investigate it, take them seriously. Maybe we consider a no bullying pledge that we ask people to sign. I think at a bare minimum, we probably need to look at our policies and our procedures, if you will. And maybe you don't have a bullying issue, but maybe you have some hot spots where bullying could occur, maybe in a dining area or in a recreational type of space or something? Do we allow people to save seats? Do we allow them to save parking spaces? What have you? So look at those types of things where we could possibly have a hotspot. Of course, it goes without saying, review your state requirements to make sure that you are in compliance, especially since some of this, again, can cross over into some of those criminal types of activities. We already mentioned some of this, but again, our goal here is to create a caring community for the individuals who live there and for us. So again, it's for all of us. We don't use obscene language, we don't name call, we don't gossip, we don't talk behind people's back, etc. And we use empathy. The reality is empathy can be taught. We treat everyone with respect and dignity. Everyone is held accountable. And I think that's the other piece of it is that, people have to understand you will be held accountable for your actions. And what I mean by that is let's take any senior living type of situation. We see bullying occur. Okay, the first person, first staff person says, no, that's unacceptable behavior. Second staff person says the same. Third does the same. Then somebody comes in and says, well, under the circumstances, I guess I can understand why you might have. No, if it's unacceptable, it's unacceptable. And everyone has to be on the same page there. We need to stand up for what is right and hold everyone accountable. I do love the idea, this last bullet, of publicly acknowledging people who go out of their way. And a lot of these types of, the things on this slide came from the literature. So some of them I think maybe are a little bit hokey. But, maybe you have a pre-move in or a new resident orientation, a caring squad, or a kings and queens of empathy. Again, I pulled that from the literature. But I like that, where you are recognizing, you are showering praise, if you will, on this person over here who has gone out of their way to make other people feel welcome. And it's almost like this operant conditioning, if you will, because that bully over here wants attention. And by bullying, they're getting attention, aren't they? It's negative attention, but they're getting it nonetheless. Maybe if they see positive behaviors getting really good attention, maybe there's an opportunity for them possibly to change some of their behaviors. We already talked about role playing. I love the idea of wellness, and we'll talk more about this on another slide. But when I hear wellness in general, those types of programs, most folks are doing physical types of things, so exercise classes or yoga or whatever. Maybe we can do things related to, compassion, tolerance, empathy, communication, and we'll talk more about some other ideas as we go along. Expanding the social network. So going back, remember we said that the bully doesn't have a lot of friends. They don't have a big social network. So maybe it's a mixer to get them involved. Maybe it's as simple as, again, I'm a therapist by background, bringing somebody into the therapy gym and saying, hey, so-and-so likes fishing. I know you do too. Maybe you guys want to do your exercises together, or seating them at the same table in the dining room or something like that. I am going to talk about this last bullet just for a second. If all else fails, do not hesitate to pull in legal consultation. Now, right now, again, I don't know where everybody is and what you're experiencing. Oftentimes, again, depends on your state, the ombudsmen are not prepared for this yet. They're not really sure how to address it. Same with our state surveyors, because there's really nothing in the survey guidelines that speak to this per se. So sometimes they are not, sometimes they are our best advocates and our help, but sometimes they're not. But don't ever hesitate to pull in legal consult to say, what do I do next? Maybe it's a lease violation notice, it's a cease and desist, it's whatever that happens to be. So I go back to this Benefis study. So remember, this was the person who went into assisted and independent living and asked about those behaviors. Went back in and asked questions and said, okay, what would you like to see? What kind of recommendations do you have related to this? And these are the things that they said. Anger management classes. Well, maybe that's something that we could do on a wellness perspective. And again, that doesn't just have to be for the bully, that could be for the target as well. Setting those limits that we talked about, holding those regular meetings for communication between people. Again, you hope they talk to each other, but they may not. Developing rules, developing expectations with the individual included in that, and then again, upholding them. You can't have just a rule set if you don't intend to follow them. And then fostering those partnerships. And really what they meant by fostering those partnerships is, again, for us as staff to address when we see this, because if we don't address it, we've just lost our trust. We've just lost the trust of the individuals who live in our community that we're actually going to address something. I mentioned, I'm not going to go over this slide, it's just basically saying, developing that caring community, sometimes it takes some baby steps. It doesn't happen overnight, but we're certainly going to get there. And I know y'all are there anyway. So let's talk a little bit more. So those were organizational interventions. Let's talk a little bit more about the bully now. So I've mentioned some of these. Don't ignore, don't avoid them. If you see something, say something, do something. We talked about those limits and making sure that that bully hears the exact same message from every single person on the team. It might be that we need to refer them to a mental health provider or some sort of external person who will help to mitigate. Oftentimes, I see our social workers in our communities getting involved here, but sometimes it has to go past the social worker. It might possibly be outside of that person's skill set that we bring in a psychologist or a psychiatrist or whoever that might be to help them. We talked a little bit about introductions and social networks. I do love the idea of identifying ways for them to feel in control. And I just want to say this because you think about the beliefs or the feelings, if you will, that the bully has. We can't tell them to simply not feel what they feel. They feel these things. What we can tell, again, remember, a lot of our seniors who are exhibiting this have not been socialized to welcome diversity like we have been. They can feel what they want to feel. What they can't do is express it in the way that they're currently expressing it. That's the piece. So that's when we go back and say, yeah, if that's what you feel, that's fine. But your behavior here was inappropriate for our situation. We're not going to tolerate it. So I think that's the important there. Assisting them too, so feeling back in control, I want to go back to that. Try to find ways to, I hate to say it this way, build them up, utilize their skill set. So maybe it's a special task or it's a special project or something that they can contribute to within the community. I do love this idea, and you'll see this on the next slide too, fostering the development of positive communication skills. So we call these I statements. So I feel frustrated when I can't sit in that favorite chair. It reminds me of, whatever. How about if I sit there during lunchtime and maybe you can sit there during the afternoon activity? That I statement is way better than get the heck out of my chair. I told you I was sitting there. That's an inappropriate type of statement. And then again, fostering the development of empathy. I don't know that this is always going to work, but again, as I mentioned before, empathy can be taught. If you have a target who is really strong and that person can share directly back to the bully, this is how you made me feel. These are my, a direct conversation that might help to foster some of that empathy. And again, not every victim is going to feel up to that, but where and when we can, that would certainly be a huge help. Now, it's interesting because the interventions for the target are similar. We're going to focus on skills to help them to not be targeted. So, assertiveness training. But with the caveat that assertiveness training sometimes gets a little out of hand, individuals who are learning assertiveness training oftentimes really can't differentiate assertiveness from aggressive types of behavior, and they end up becoming the victim bully. So we have to, just watch that fine line there. And again, assertiveness training might be something that we pull into some of our wellness offerings. We've talked about some of these de-escalation training, self-help groups, support groups, what have you. Maybe they have to do a cease and desist, some sort of restraining order or something. You hate to go that direction, but it is possible. Again, fostering their self-worth and their dignity, find their strengths, their skill set, showcase those. So very similar to what we just talked about. And then again, those I statements. So instead of saying, oh, you just make me so angry, or you make me so mad, you're so insensitive, you're a jerk, whatever. When you raise your voice at me, it really embarrasses me. Or when you make fun of the way that I walk, that embarrasses me in front of my friends. I wish you wouldn't do that. So, very specific statements back related to the behavior that that person would like to see changed. So, what else? I think we've talked about some of this, but the best way to halt the behavior is let's make sure it doesn't start in the first place. So identify a cause. If you see somebody getting, picked on verbally, physically, whatever, speak out, step up, bring it to someone's attention. And I think staff training, I'm going to go back to that for just a second. Everyone needs to know what is your protocol. I hope you all have policies related to bullying already. If you don't, this is the time to certainly develop those, but just to make sure that staff know who to talk to, who to go to. Our individuals in our communities know the same. Remembering too that there are barriers to reporting. There's that shame, that fear of retaliation, et cetera. And I do believe this, I think we do need to do everything in our power to support the target. If that person comes to us, we want to thank them first of all. Thank you so much for coming to me. Thank you for sharing. That took some guts for you to come to me and tell me about that. I think it's important then too, I have to be cautious how I say this, to ask them, okay, now that you've shared that with me, do I have your permission to share that with the rest of the care team so that we can make the best intervention to help you? So I ask that permission to share, obviously with the caveat that if you are, we are all mandatory reporters, I know that. If it truly is elder abuse or something, or it is a criminal type of thing, it is harassment or hazing or assault or something, that's a totally different story. We report that immediately. I know that we have to report elder abuse with certain timeframes. But if it's not that, I do feel like that shows a lot of trust, a lot of respect for that person's dignity to ask them if we can share that. So that's just kind of an aside there. Some older adult coping skills. So coping with this, it's a complex process, right? And some of these, you know, this could be for the bully, this could be for the target. I also like the idea of maybe incorporating some of this into wellness where we can do that. So for our bully, hey, just tune it out, just let it go, walk away. My husband says this to me all the time. You know what you could have said there? Nothing. And I giggle because I will, and he happens to be in the room right now because we are on vacation as a family, and he's laughing because I called him out on it. But that's just it. Teach your bully. You know what you could have done there? You could have just walked away and said nothing to that person. Avoid that contact, bite your tongue, what have you. Um, Engage in positive self-talk for our target. See the other person's point of view. I love that for our bully because again, they have these feelings, they have views or whatever. Can we somehow teach them to say, hey, I don't understand X, Y, and Z, or teach me a little bit about your culture or your background. And that goes a long way to fostering, again, that empathy. So pets, again, we see a lot of really good benefit, even from our robotic pets, for de-escalation, for dealing with anxiety and frustration, again, particularly for the bully, again, for the target as well. Things that we can teach individuals. Again, these are really simple things. And I'm not saying this is the answer. If there's truly bullying, of course you address it. But some of this is really helpful. I'm the target. You know what? I'm going to let my emotions settle before I approach that bully and say something. Then when I come back, I'm going to approach that conversation. I'm going to maintain that eye contact, use that person's name. This is how I felt. A very fact-based conversation where we don't do a counterattack because that's not going to give us any sort of benefit. So maybe again, those are some self-help types of things that we can teach individuals. For us, for staff, and I think we've talked about some of this. We've talked about policies. And again, if you don't have a policy, my advice to you, take it for what it's worth, go to your schools. Go to your schools. They have some amazing policies, very, very well developed, that we don't have to tweak a whole lot to make them applicable for our own settings. As I already said, we're always going to support the target, and we encourage everyone to report. Some in general, I say facility responses, community response, whatever we want to talk about it. But again, my advice is to assess the extent of the problem within your community. I'm sure you've seen some of this. Maybe you've not seen a great exposure to bullying, but certainly ask, what are the conditions within your community that might allow bullying to occur? Where are your hotspots? And is your program effective? Train your staff. And again, that can't just be a one and done. This has to be very, very much ongoing. Familiarize everyone with what those reporting strategies are. Again, it's confidential. It's not anonymous, but it's confidential. And then of course we ask to share that. And we already talked a little bit about anger management, counseling, those sorts of things that possibly we can engage in. So I found this out in the literature, and I kind of think it's a little basic, but I'm going to go over it anyway. It's just a quick framework on how you would respond to an incident. So again, you have a staff member or you observe or somebody, you're told about a situation that's involving bullying. What do you do? Well, first and foremost, you will always make sure that everyone is out of harm's way. So you make sure that you've taken your immediate steps to de-escalate if that's possible, move anybody out of imminent danger, out of any sort of physical harm, etc. Then that's where you follow your policy. You notify whoever is the appropriate person to notify, whoever that leadership is. That person comes in and does the same thing. They assess for any sort of physical danger. Have we safeguarded the victim? Have we done everything that we can do, at least for now, to de-escalate the situation and keep everyone safe? Then we take those next steps. The first part being determine, has a crime been committed? Has elder abuse occurred here? So again, we can consider that. And if that's the case, you notify the appropriate authorities, whatever or whoever that happens to be. Then we determine, do we notify any sort of families or anybody else? And that's an interesting one because I think sometimes we notify our families about everything. Maybe we do in this situation, maybe we don't. Again, that's going to be up to you and your policies. Do we need to pull in any sort of legal representation? I don't really know there. So then we figure out, okay, what are we going to do about this? We gather information. So we take accounts from witnesses. We talk with individuals maybe who observed it, somebody who has additional background, somebody who's seen these people, these individuals get into some sort of verbal altercation somewhere along the line, et cetera. Get all the information that we possibly can, and then we brainstorm our solutions. So maybe the bully would benefit from counseling. Maybe these two individuals need some sort of mediation. Maybe there's an environmental factor. Maybe there's adjoining rooms or a proximity to one another at a social gathering, something that we can do along those lines. If it's dementia and this person is exhibiting behaviors, then what's the reason for that? We look at dementia behaviors as a form of communication, but something is causing that behavior. So let's try to get to the bottom of that. What is triggering that person? Can they be redirected or what have you? So you try and figure out the reason of what corrective action you could take. You take that plan, you implement it, and if it resolved your issue, then as I say, rock on with your bad self. If not, then you go back to the drawing board and you try to figure out, okay, what else could I do? How else could this, could I correct this to implement? We reassess and have other solutions. So I think that's kind of basic. But I think it all starts with, again, making sure that individuals are safe, and then we go on that fact-finding mission. So I'm going to conclude, and we're just about at time, but again, I'm happy to hang out and answer any questions if anybody has them. I would just say this: when you look at the current research, you can read the bullet. The current estimates misjudge the bullying problem. It appears as though as many elders are bullied in our country as individuals as our youth in high school, middle school, grammar school, etc. We also have to recognize that bullying among our seniors is likely to continue. We're going to continue to see it, and it's going to evolve as we go along. It may not be about politics or religion or what have you. I just saw a situation not long ago related to COVID. I was in a community where if you were fully vaccinated, you could go to this activity and you didn't have to wear a mask. If one person was not vaccinated, everyone had to wear a mask at that activity. So the individuals who had to wear masks were bullying that person who was not vaccinated. So I'm not getting into anything related to COVID, but so it's evolving. And we're seeing a lot of different reasons for the bullying coming about. So that's what we have to recognize. And as our understanding about this related again to our youth evolved and developed during the 1900s, which sounds so weird for me to say, we need to evolve too with this understanding. So just learning about the problem, trying to figure out some of those solutions. I guess our goal here is to the best of our abilities, be proactive. So hopefully it just doesn't occur at all. But if it does occur, we are reactive in a way that we protect our seniors. And of course, we want to make sure that our folks are not ignored and they are, in fact, kept safe. So again, I know I am right at time, but this is my contact information. And as I mentioned, as we went through, I will PDF these slides and I will get them over to Sarah, who can certainly distribute them to anybody who is here. But if anybody has any comments or questions, again, feel free to pop those into chat. I'd be more than happy to take a look at those. I learn from y'all just as much as you learn from me. I hear stories and solutions and such as we go along. So if anybody has those, pop them into the chat. And otherwise, I'll turn it back over to you, Ms. Sarah.